This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. We are diving right in with a question from Ksenia from Slovenia, who says, why is the human race slowly getting taller and taller? What would be an evolutionary or any other explanation for that?
Well, a couple of facets to that. First off, if we are getting taller and taller, one might ask, how much is this due to a change in the gene pool? In which case, one absolutely should ask about evolution. The other thing is, are we actually getting taller? And it depends on when you're looking. There was a very interesting paper, 2022, in Proceedings, National Academy of Sciences, an international group of more than 40 authors led by somebody at Penn State who looked through bones from humans, European populations from 12,000 years ago, and a large array of these, and you can measure them, and from individual bones you can figure out how tall someone was. And they came up with a very emphatic finding, which is quite striking, which is around 12,000 years ago, Europeans got shorter. They got about 1.5 inches shorter. That's puzzling. First off, how did they know that? You could look at bones from individuals from before then and see that there was a decline. Also, you could look at the genetic profiles of these individuals. You could do genomic analyses from the bones, and you can put together something called a polygenic risk score, which would tell you, with this array of 20,000 genes, statistically, what's the height of this individual likely to be. And people from about 12,000 years ago were coming up about 1.5 inches short. What's this about? Maybe their comparison groups were not the same ethnic groups. They controlled for all of that. They did a great job. So why did Europeans get shorter about 12,000 years ago? And the answer is something that I have ranted and raved about repeatedly in here, which is the profound stupidity of the invention of agriculture. This is around when Europe was becoming widely agricultural, and the transition, 99% of human history spent as small, nomadic, mobile hunter-gatherer bands. Suddenly, by around 12,000 years ago, crops are getting domesticated, animals are getting domesticated, people are beginning to live sedentary lifestyles. And what I've always said is agriculture, invention of it was a disaster. Hunter gathering, you spend far less of your day getting sufficient calories than if you were a traditional agriculturist. Hunter gathering is far healthier in terms of diseases, longer life expectancy. Hunter gathering, we should all be out there, I don't know, getting roots and tubers in Silicon Valley and hunting the gophers up in the hills and stuff. The transition to agriculture was a disaster. Life expectancy got shorter and height got shorter. What's this about? All the disadvantages of becoming agriculturalists. First off, instead of depending on 40, 50 different edible plants scattered through your rainforest, you're suddenly down to 3 or 4 different crops, which makes you vulnerable to crop infestations, to droughts, to famines. The rate of malnutrition goes up dramatically as soon as agriculture was invented. Next, all sorts of diseases became more common, infectious diseases, due to two things. One is people living stably in close proximity to each other. Hamlets, villages, towns, and the extraordinary facet of that, people, as opposed to hundreds of thousands of years of mobile nomadic hunter-gatherers, people now not only living close to their neighbors, but living day after day on top of their feces, being exposed to that. So infectious disease load running through humans much more rapidly. And as we kind of learned from COVID not that long ago, when you are in close proximity to animals, animal diseases can jump the species barrier more readily. So, sort of evidence that they would show for that, a nice part of the study was they looked at the bones. They had paleopatho-osteological analyses looking for markers of unhealthy bones. And what you look for is something called porosity, which has all sorts of fancy additional phrases going along with it, or thinning of enamel. If you're malnourished in childhood, the enamel you develop on your teeth doesn't get quite as thick. And what they saw was 70% of the bones from that period, the skulls, the teeth, so on, were showing markers of this pathology. So that's not good. That's not good. And that turned out not to be good for 9,000 years after that. That's how long it took for average European height to return to what it was before people decided agriculture was a good idea. So, in the long span of human history, we're not getting taller. We're recovering from a period of profound loss of height. How about the last couple of centuries? What you see in Europe is that there has been a gradual increase in height, something called a secular trend with each quarter century average height in pretty much every country looked at. You see people are getting bigger on the average, and what that's due to is better nutrition and more control of infectious disease. So that's a good thing. How about contemporary stuff? First off, what's the tallest country on earth? It's the people in the Netherlands. And that produces a finding which is statistically inevitable, but just begs for propagandistic misattribution. The people in the Netherlands are the tallest in the world, but over the last decade, on the average, they've been getting shorter. Oh, malnutrition, what's going on there? It is immigrants coming into the Netherlands. Oh my God, those immigrants, not only are they murderous a la our president, but they make people shorter somehow. No, by definition, if you have a population which on the average is the tallest, and you bring in a random sampling of people from any other population, you are going to dilute this property. The average height is going to go down. It's got nothing to do with anything other than something absolutely obligatory in statistics. So the Netherlands, what other interesting height trends? Africa. Africa overall, people are shorter now than they were at the end of colonialism, predominantly in the early to mid 60s. What's that about? Increasing infectivity, increased percentage of people living in urban populations where your food quality is not so great. And very strikingly, every African country with a quote westernized economy is somehow persuaded to give up a huge amount of their food growing land for growing cash crops to sell in the West. Kenya, for example, biggest exports are coffee and tea. Acres and hectares and square kilometers of space being used there that used to be used for food. When you were selling your cash crop overseas, you're almost certainly having to buy their food back, economically disadvantaged exchange rates. So you get malnutrition that way. Okay, so Africa's been getting shorter. Overall international trends. What are the shortest countries on earth? Number one out there is East Timor, Timor-Leste in East Indonesia, which is one of those places you do not want to have been in the last half century. Other very short countries, Nepal, Laos, Bangladesh, Yemen, Madagascar, where else? Guatemala. Those are the shortest countries on earth. Tallest countries, you bet, starting with the Netherlands. You've got the Scandinavian countries, including Denmark and Iceland, filling out the top 10, along with countries from the Balkans and countries from the Baltic. Those are the tallest nations on earth, having some of the longest life expectancies. Things look good there. So we say with ethnocentric closed-mindedness and narrow myopic view. What about the United States? And the United States is interesting because a little more than a century ago, 1914, people in the United States were on the average the third tallest people in the world. I don't know why we weren't number one. America, look out for, but at least we were number three out of then, I don't know, 150 countries or so. America was looking pretty good. As of the last census a few years ago, American males now rank number 37 in average height across the world. American females rank number 42 in average height. We have dropped dramatically. Average male height now in the United States, males 5'9", females 5'4". The peak height, average peak height for Americans was achieved somewhere in the 1990s. What does that mean? It means things have peaked, have plateaued, have asymptoted, and then in the last decade, something that has demographers gasping with shock, average height in the United States has been declining along with average life expectancy. Oh, obviously that was because of COVID. This was pre-COVID. This was the 2020 census, pre-COVID data that was based on what's going on in the United States and all the diseases of westernized lifestyle that's killing Americans on the average at an earlier age are also making them shorter. Obesity, heart disease, and probably most informatively, what are now called diseases of despair. Princeton economists Anna Case and Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate in economics, invented the term diseases of despair of people being done in by substance abuse, accidents, violence, suicide. And what you see is that playing out with younger Americans, more impairment of growth. Americans are not as tall as they used to be. Okay, you would immediately say, no, 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 no. Here's the confound here, which is America has been having a vast influx of immigrants from around the rest of the world. And obviously, they're diluting our gene stock. And just ask J.D. Vance about that. And that's absolutely no. As it turns out, the loss of average height is most pronounced in non-Hispanic white Americans. It is less of a trend among Hispanic Americans, African Americans. It is predominantly a white non-Hispanic phenomenon. It's something other than diluting our gene pool with all of these short foreigners who don't care about American baseball or who knows what. No, it is most strikingly been hitting the population of Americans who are most angry about being left behind culturally, economically, etc. And that is rural white America. So what that suggests is this interesting thing. Well, height is like 80% genetic. It's a very heavily genetic trait with hundreds and hundreds of genes involved in regulating height. Nonetheless, it's telling you environmental factors, psychosocial factors, all of those appear to be very important because you track the height loss, and what it tracks most closely is as degrees of income inequality increase in a state, in a city, in neighborhoods, average height of kids is going down along with life expectancy. That is a big driving force. So, whoa, psychosocial factors can affect height. Here's some other examples of really how to appreciate this. You look, for example, at North Korea versus South Korea. Same exact gene stock historically, same people, same genetics of height. And currently, there's about a 4-inch difference. People in North Korea, on the average, about 4 inches shorter. You look in East Africa, Kenya has a higher standard of living, longer life expectancy than its immediate neighbors, Uganda and Tanzania, about a 2-inch difference in height. For me, the most interesting one of all is Central America. You got Costa Rica. Costa Rica is the Switzerland of Central America. That's what everyone is obliged to say. And Costa Rica, stable, peaceful. They haven't had an army for years. They don't have conflict, very low levels of malnutrition. Things are wonderful there. And compared to many of their extremely unstable Central American countries, an average of 2 inches difference. People in Costa Rica, on the average, are 2 inches taller than everybody else in Central America, the same general gene pool. So what you see is psychosocial factors can have a big effect on height. What you see is the answer to the question, why are we getting taller? The answer is, well, we're not consistently getting taller. It depends on where you're looking in the world and whether you're looking at trends from the last 50 years or so, the last 2 centuries, or the last 15,000 years. Very, very local effects going on there.
So now, Olga from the UK asks, why do humans lose or evolve without their tails? Would that not come as a benefit to us?
It would come as a huge benefit. I've mourned my entire life the fact that we as a species no longer have tails. We and all the other apes, the tailless apes, the great apes, the lesser apes, none of us apes have tails, which is in some ways a disadvantage. What are the good things you could do with the tail? If you're a spider monkey, if you're a whole bunch of other species of monkeys there, you have prehensile tails. They're like a fifth hand. They can do all sorts of coordinated stuff. They stabilize you as you were balancing in a tree, as you were leaping through the trees. They give you stability for all sorts of predatory species when you're chasing after someone. If they're making curves and cutting corners, the tail bends one way or the other, like, I don't know, the wings, the rudders, whatever in airplanes to stabilize. They're very useful. And most of all, they help you sit up stably. If you're a baboon, you prop your rear end against the base of your tail, and that keeps you nice and steady. Oh, great. So you could sit there nice and steady. This is actually very useful at night when you're asleep up in a tree because you want your tail to be stabilizing you there so that you don't fall out of the tree sometime during the night while you're sleeping. Not a good thing. Very interestingly, probably most interestingly from a behavioral evolution standpoint, what tails are also good for is communicating information. Tails sticking straight up, tails wagging, tails between your legs. Tails are wonderful. And then all the apes lost their tails, lost in all the taxonomic term, the hominidae, which I guess is Greek for the folks who don't need kilts anymore. All the tails disappeared. And when was this? This was about the time of the last common ancestor of all of the apes, about 25 million years ago. After those destined to become contemporary apes and those destined to become contemporary monkeys had split off. That was before that. So about 25 million years ago. What's interesting is, unlike the evolution of some traits, it's not that 25 million years ago you suddenly see all these ancestral chimp, human, orang gorillas with each passing million years getting shorter and shorter tails. Tails disappeared about 25 million years ago among the ancestors of all of the contemporary apes, including us. So what happened? One would expect, tails, prehensile, communicative, all of that. This is going to be a complicated bit of evolutionary change. Remarkably, it was very, very simple. And it comes down to a single gene, a gene called TBXT, which codes for a protein called brachyury. And what is it? It's a transcription factor. It regulates the activity of other genes, and it is very relevant to development of the spinal column. You find it in every animal out there, this gene, and it regulates the length of the spine and the flexibility that the bones are going to have. And 25 million years ago, there was a mutation in the common ancestor of all of the contemporary apes, and that knocked out tails. You look at all of the apes, and instead of tails, they have coccyxes, little vestigial, little mini shrunken tailbone things there inside your rear end. The tail got knocked out due to a mutation in a single gene. The mutation itself is interesting if you care about this stuff. If you're a molecular biology type, the gene for this spinal chordal growth factor, TBXT, it comes in a number of broken parts, exons, if you care about the jargon. And there's a whole bunch of exons, and there's, among other things, exon 6. And 25 million years ago, something interesting happened to exon 6. And it's a rare type of mutation, which is a bit of random DNA that was just floating around and hopping around, got stuck in on one side of exon 6. Random bit of DNA, something called a jumping gene, a transposon, a transposable genetic element, which we've talked about before. And just by chance, what made this a once in a gazillion year thing, it happened that another bit of random DNA, something in primates called an ALU, ALU, an ALU sequence, popped in on the other side of this exon 6, two of these. And it turns out they're structure stuff that they're attracted to each other. And as soon as you begin to have gene duplication and you loosen stuff up, the two ALU sequences pull towards each other and bind to each other. And the DNA between them now forms a loop coding for this exon 6. It's doing nothing. The rest of the DNA is going about doing its stuff. And there's little like processing enzyme thingies that come along. And here's this little weirdo hairpin thing of DNA. Let's clip it off. And you now have the gene lacking this exon 6. That appears to be what happened 25 million years ago. Rare type of mutation. You see it in some neurological diseases. And what this did was knock out, apparently, the key feature of this gene that produces spinal columns that are long enough to develop into tails and to be prehensile. And as frosting on top of the cake, tour de force, a few years back, a group genetically engineered mice where they knocked out their own version of that gene and put in the ape version. And these were mice that were born without tails. Really extraordinary. Okay, so back to the basic evolution question lurking in here. Are there upsides or there downsides to not having a tail? We already know some of the downsides. You lose some of your communicative palette of ways of talking to your fellow species members, a little bit less stability when you're running, when you're sitting, problems there. As it turns out, having an ape spinal column makes you more vulnerable to a number of neurodevelopmental spinal problems, most common being spina bifida, which is not very common, but nonetheless is an ape specialty. What are some of the advantages? Not a whole lot. What do you see with monkeys when they're running through trees? They're running along branches and using their tails for stability. That's not what apes do. Apes brachiate with their arms from one branch to another to another. Not at all clear if that has some advantages, but possibly explanatory. This brachiating, this strength in the arms there, this orientation to the vertical instead of the horizontal was a pre-adaptation for apes eventually becoming bipedal. Whoa, that explains everything. That doesn't really explain everything because that didn't happen for about 20 million years later. It just set you up for being able to become bipedal. Your great, great, great grandkids 20 million years later. It's not clear what advantages or disadvantages there were. We just had a mutation, one single gene.
Given that it involved a simple mutation in a single gene, and amid all the excitement about de-extinction of dire wolves and mammoths, do you think it might be possible to de-extinct human tails? I mean, I'm not sure why we'd want to, but maybe it's worth using a genetic engineering technique like CRISPR to give us tails again. I'm sure furries would love that.
You wonder why we'd want to? That would be the greatest thing. And in principle, that's relatively easy. You're de-extincting dire wolves and mammoths, and that's involving manipulating a massive number of genes. Just pop out that tailless ape gene and stick in the real vertebrate version, and we'd have tails. That would be fantastic. I wish they would do that. I yearn for that.
Okay, finally, Kaneen from Thailand says, in your previous video, you mentioned that naked mole rats do not senesce. So I was wondering, why does every other organism experience senescence? What is the evolutionary advantage? Since it is so widespread and it's evidently possible to avoid, why is it selected for?
Well, this is rounding out our trio today of evolution questions. And this is a really good one because there's some surprises in the answer to the question. Naked mole rats, that was episode 91, went through their incredible social systems and physiology. And one of the other things about them is they don't senesce. What is senescence? We went through it then. Senescence is, with the passage of time, for the same environmental kick in the ass, you were more likely to sustain damage. Senescence is why you slip on the ice when you're 80 and you're more likely to break your pelvis than if you do that as a 20-year-old. Increased fragility, increased vulnerability. And the way you see that is with the passage of time, the percentage of the population still alive begins to drop off steeply as the vulnerability, the senescence kicks in. Naked mole rats do not show senescence. They do not show that sudden decline there. They die and age simply as a function of whatever the world's throwing at them. How are they managing not to have increased fragility as they get older? And briefly, we touched on some of the mechanisms for it. They live underground, so they're very used to life with low oxygen levels. And it turns out if you've adapted to that, one of the big pluses for that is you don't make a whole lot of oxygen radicals. They're really good at repairing their DNA, their chromosome telomeres that in all the rest of us get shorter. They're able to resist. Okay, so naked mole rats don't senesce. Why do the rest of us? Why did the rest of us organisms evolve senescing, getting more fragile with time? And the first big surprise is most organisms do not senesce. Most organisms do not show this property of the longer they've been around, the more likely they are to be done in by some environmental challenge. Senescence is not very common out there. Moreover, the next big surprise is when you look at the species that have senescence, they're some of the fancier ones. They're in the evolutionary avant-garde. We've relatively recently evolved genes to make us fall apart when we get older. What's the logic of that? So back to the first surprise there. Most species on Earth do not senesce. As implied by the second thing I said, these are not very exciting species. They're not very complicated. Let's see, there's the dwarf gorse, which sounds like Jabberwocky. It's some sort of shrub. Or there's the Gorgonian coral, which I assume Daenerys had necklaces made of. And then there is a jellyfish called the immortal jellyfish called Turritopsis, which lives forever in principle, because anytime it is injured in any way, stressed by food shortages, by temperature changes, whatever, it does something amazing. It regresses back to its fetal baby form and then regrows anew and starts a new life expectancy. And they go on forever. On a whim, just showing what our AI error is doing to us. On a whim, I just got onto an AI and said, tell me a joke about Turritopsis, the immortal jellyfish. And the joke was, why did the immortal jellyfish keep getting thrown out of the nursing home? It kept getting younger. They get younger. After an injury, they get younger all the way back to their simplest form, and then they grow again. Do they live forever? Do these other species, these gorses and Gorgonian thingies, do they live forever? No, they simply die as a function of external disasters. You take a dwarf gorse or you take a human and you hit them with an asteroid, and neither is going to do very well. Their decline is simply a function of the rate of external insults. So that's what you see in the less fancy, complicated organisms out there. You don't see senescence. And a way of graphing that out is you look at initially 100% of their population, and over time, they're heading down to zero because eventually something's going to happen to all of them. All of the current ones will eventually die, but you see it forms a straight line of the population declining. If you put it on a log scale, don't worry about the details, but you basically see a steady rate at which those organisms die. Simply as a function of what the world is hurling at them, they are exactly as resilient or exactly as vulnerable as they were at any other point in life. So along comes the fancy species that have genes for senescence. And what's that about? Really interesting. So we just looked at this population decline, this straight line on a log scale, the straight line of organisms that do not senesce. Now let's look at organisms that do senesce. And what you see is, as the decline is happening, suddenly it gets a lot steeper. Suddenly there's a big drop off in numbers. As opposed to the non-senescers who just continue the straight line, there's suddenly an inflection point and they drop off rapidly. That's the aging. That's the senescence. That's the increased vulnerability. That's them getting more fragile over time. And thus the rate at which the population dies gets suddenly faster. Bummer, that's what the aging looks like. But then you look at something else, and something that is virtually universal with species that have evolved genes for senescence. What you see is earlier in life, they survive better than the non-senescent species. They last longer. They have a drop off that is the start of senescence, but earlier on, they've got some sort of advantage, survival advantage. And you suddenly have, when people talk about gerontology, the pathology of aging, framed this way, if you get enough of a survival advantage early in life, and the bill eventually comes because there's no free lunch, as long as the amount of advantage and how early in life it comes and how much you're reproducing early in life, the advantage, if that is big enough to outweigh the accelerated senescence disadvantage at the end there, this is not a disease. This is an evolutionary advantage. This is something, a great genetic thing to have evolved, where eventually the bill comes. And the jargon that's given for this, the term for this is negative pleiotropy. Mentioned the word pleiotropy a few weeks ago. This is in a slightly different context. Negative pleiotropy, also called antagonistic pleiotropy. And what this is about is genes that code for a selective, a fitness, a Darwinian advantage early in life, but then the bill comes and you do worse later on. And this is a very common theme of the genes that drive senescence. We did not evolve genes so that we fall apart as we get old. We evolved genes that boost our reproductive potential earlier in life. And then there's a price to pay. So what would a negative pleiotropic gene look like? There's a couple of examples. One of them is something you find in all sorts of male primates, which has to do with the prostate gland. It does something or other, I try not to think about it, but the prostate gland, the primate prostate gland, has something advantageous going for it in that it has, compared to other mammals, it's got a very high metabolic rate. And somehow that makes your sperm run faster and jump higher, and it enhances your reproductive success early in life. So what's the bill that eventually comes? You can't have a prostate with an elevated metabolic rate your whole life without greatly increasing the risk that at some point metabolism is going to spiral out of control into prostate cancer, a remarkably common thing in aging male primates. Another example, your inflammatory response. You get bonked on the head, you get inflammation, it does all sorts of protective stuff. The inflammatory response is so ancient, it's great. And early in life, when you get a lot of knocks on the head and a lot of challenges, the inflammatory system is really protective. What you see, though, is the cumulative amount of inflammation you've been exposed to over your lifespan acts as a pacemaker of senescent decline because a history of lots of inflammation has been just kicking away at the ankles of every outpost in your body, wear and tear going on there. The inflammatory response is wonderfully advantageous for individual insults early in life, and eventually the bill comes in the form of what your cumulative inflammatory load was over your lifetime. Another example of negative pleiotropy. So making sense of senescence, where'd that come from? For one thing, that's a recent evolutionary invention, and we didn't recently evolve genes for falling apart dramatically. We evolved genes that confer advantages early in life, and if the advantage is big enough, it's worth the trade-off of falling apart later on. That's what the genetics of senescence is most about.
And that's all for episode 101. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.